Glasgow Open Doors Day. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Did you ask her about going out tonight? What'd she say?
You heard what she said.
Well, what's the matter with her anyway?
Oh, I don't know. She says that I think more of you than I do of her.
Well, you do, don't you?
But we won't go into that.
Yes. Brilliant. Couple of funny men there, and a couple of funny men on your screen now. John, how are you doing?
I'm very well. That little piece of film, even after all this time, it still makes me smile.
It still makes you laugh. And of course, I should like to everybody's tuning in for virtual Glasgow Open Doors. I am in the Panopticon Theatre here in Glasgow, and I'm looking up there at the stage where the legend that is Stan Laurel made his debut. And John, you are in Dublin, I believe, and I can see a Sons of the Desert hat behind you on a skull. Presumably that's not a real skull, but the Sons of the Desert hat.
That will have to remain our and the police's secret, I think.
All right, I say nothing. So listen, the first question, I'm just going to bring you in, and then hopefully anybody out there who has any questions for us can start firing them in. And if John and I can shut up for a couple of minutes, we'll let them in and we'll let them ask their questions. So the first question, John, first of all, can I just show everybody this? This is, it says on it, a novel, John Connolly. It's all about a guy called Stan Laurel. I thoroughly recommend the book. It's an absolutely brilliant read. John, why Stan Laurel?
Well, I grew up with them. I'm of that generation for whom they were part of your TV viewing. As I used to remark, when the racing from Haydock Park was cancelled, or you're on your summer holidays, they would slot in a 20-minute short to fill a little bit of space. So I had a huge amount of affection for Laurel and Hardy. I didn't know a great deal about them, to be perfectly honest, for much of my life. And then I was staying with a friend in Malibu. He had a not very fancy house in Malibu, but a perfectly nice house, when I was touring my first book. And he was an early internet adopter. So he was selling stuff on eBay, and his house was just filled with junk. And I said to him, is there anything you wouldn't keep, you would want to hold on to? And he said, well, that's very dangerous if you're a seller, because you begin to get sentimental about things, and the next thing you know, your house is filled with junk. I want to say your house is already filled with junk, so I'm not sure, what difference that's going to make. But he said the only thing he ever regretted losing was a hat that Stan Laurel had given him. And now Shelley, who was the bookseller, was probably, he was 20 years older than I was. But I still kind of said, how could you have met Stan Laurel? And it turned out, of course, that for much of Stan Laurel's life, certainly the end of his life, he spent in a little apartment in Santa Monica by the sea with his name in the telephone directory. And you could look him up if you were a fan, and you could call him. And if he liked to say, could have your jib, he would invite you around, and you could maybe have a cup of tea and a biscuit. And he would, if he liked you an awful lot, especially if you were a kid, he would give you a little cheap Derby hat to take away as a souvenir. And it was really the genesis. That was the genesis of the book, because I remember thinking, what had he been doing for all this time? Because really their productive career, I think, stops in 1939 with A Chump in Oxford. It's the last, film, and even that has its problems. They're getting a bit old. The films that come after that generally aren't very good and don't make the most of them. And so what he had been doing was living quietly with his fifth wife, depending on how you count them, writing sketches that would never be performed for Laurel and Hardy, because Oliver Hardy had predeceased him in 1957. And when Oliver Hardy dies, he simply stops working. And not only does he stop working, he stops making any public appearances. He does not want to be seen without this man with whom he spent so much time. And so I began exploring his life, and increasingly began to feel that there was a book in there somewhere. Originally, I wasn't sure what kind of book it was. I thought at one point I was going to write a very short critical piece about them, just explaining my affection for them. But there was more to him than that. And I think those kind of books had been written already, whereas a book like I don't think had been written before.
I'm just really intrigued that you wrote it as a novel. We've had a conversation before. I read a voracious reader of biographies, and sort of like when I picked this up and I wrote, the first thing I noticed was it says a novel, and I thought that's a novel way to do it. Why did you write it as a novel as opposed to the sort of bog standard biography?
Well, I think there have been some very good biographies written about them already. And more recently, there's an American writer and critic, Randy Scrivite, whose name I can never quite pronounce, but I think it's Scrivite, who has written, really the last word on Laurel Hardy in terms of critical analysis and to some degree biographical analysis. Stan Laurel, he was a prodigious correspondent. He wrote an awful lot of letters. In fact, there is an online Stan Laurel correspondence project where you can read a lot of it. A lot of this material is now online. He sent letters the way we send emails now. He would just send a note to somebody to say, hello, how are you? I think he just liked putting stamps on things, really. But he doesn't reveal a lot about his emotional life. And he doesn't reveal a lot about, beyond his professional feelings for Oliver Hardy, he doesn't speak a great deal about their friendship. And he certainly doesn't talk about his 5 marriages, his affairs, his common law wife, because obviously he's a product of Victorian England. He's no desire to, put his dirty laundry out there. And even when he's writing to his wives, some of that correspondence is available. He's very circumspect. Only very occasionally, when perhaps he's been drinking, there are a couple of letters where he's been drinking, he revealed something of himself. So biographical fiction is not very good for exploring emotional lives of people who are quite self-contained and private, because it's very difficult to delve into them. Fiction is slightly better for that because you have a little bit of room for maneuver. But having said that, you have a duty towards people who are real, towards people who have lived lives. You can't just make stuff up. And I'd read a very interesting, about the time that he came out, I read an interview with the actor Bryan Cranston from Breaking Bad, who had been nominated for an Oscar for playing Dalton Trumbo. And he was asked about his research. And he said, what I did was I read everything I could find about Trumbo, any correspondence he'd left, whatever biographical material I could find. And he said it was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. And you'll see it here and there, you have pieces missing. And those missing pieces are often to do with the inner lives of the person, of the people you're involved with. In his case, Dalton Trumbo. In my case, Stan Laurel, because the process was very similar. But because you can see all the other pieces around it, you can make a very educated guess about what belongs in that missing piece. You can, you're not just pulling stuff out of the air. You're actually constructing a very likely section that will fit in there, that will fill in that piece that we don't know about. And that's what the process was with Stan Laurel. It involved reading an awful lot and thinking, well, in this situation, how would he have felt from what we know about him? What would his response have been? But by and large, the book, I got a very angry email. Very occasionally I get angry emails from people. A very angry email from a man who said, why, the book is terrible. How can you make all this stuff up about him? Actually, nothing in the book is made up. All we have occasionally are conversations that are imagined. But actually, the circumstances in which those conversations arise are there. They're part of the record. I'm not making up the fact that for a very long time, he had a French mistress. He had this French actress, Alice Ardell, that when his wife is mourning the death of their child, he is sleeping with Alice Ardell. He is a complicated man. And I think one of the difficulties, I did an event at the lovely Laurel and Hardy Museum in Ulverston in England. And one of the staff there wouldn't come to the event. And he wouldn't come to the event in part because of the way the book had dealt with Laurel and Hardy, but also because of how it had dealt with Charlie Chaplin in particular. He felt very aggrieved. And I think there's a little part of us that wants to imagine that the two men we saw on screen were exactly like that in real life, that they didn't have adult problems, that they were somehow these kind of childlike figures that mumbled and stumbled their way through life. And that's not the case. These were complex men with often quite complex emotional problems. And to sentimentalize them in that way is to detract from the artistry of what you see on the screen, is to imagine that all they were doing was somehow replicating their lives. So, you know, yeah, you may not want to know sometimes the slightly darker side of the people that you love. And actually, I don't think, to be fair, Stan Laurel had a very dark side. Chaplin, we can come on and talk about Chaplin. Chaplin, I think, does. There's something almost unpleasant going on in the background in Chaplin. With Stan Laurel, we don't have that. Stan Laurel's problem really is, his only problem, I think, is that he doesn't want to be alone. He likes being in a relationship. He likes having the security of a domestic situation. He likes being with a woman who will provide him with stability, because if he has that stability, he can be adventurous in his art, I think. And so he would rather be with the wrong person than be with nobody at all. And so it leads to a succession of marriages that are, in some cases, tragically bad. And in the case of his first wife, Lois, just kind of tragic, I think. But other than that, when I finished the book, there is a real danger in, I remember some years ago, a man named Roger Lewis, who writes, I think, for the Times now, he often does reviews. He was putting together a biography of Anthony Burgess. He wanted to write about the writer Anthony Burgess. And so he began assembling all this material, and he took an advance, because there really hadn't been a good critical biography of Burgess, who had only died fairly recently. And he got about a quarter of the way into the research and thought, you know, Anthony Burgess could be a bit difficult. About halfway through and thought Anthony Burgess could be very difficult. And three-quarters of the way he thought, really, I don't like Anthony Burgess at all. But he had taken the money to write this book. And when you read Roger Lewis's book about Anthony Burgess, his problems with Burgess and his dislike of Burgess creep through. For all of the research and all the time I spent with Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, at the end of it, I liked them even more than I did at the beginning. I had even more affection for them, and I had even more appreciation for what they achieved on film and in life.
The wee imagined conversations that you've written, that's one of the highlights of the book for me. I think you nailed that absolutely brilliant. And I loved the wee sections when it was, you know, the wee conversations. But the other thing that I really loved, and I'd like to ask you about, it's not quite Stan Laurel, it's Jimmy Finlayson, who was one of the unsung heroes. You know, that kind of that Homer Simpson nicked, obviously.
Yeah.
And the fact that Jimmy Finlayson, I knew he came from Falkirk direction. I think you were more specific. You said Larbert, which is just next to Falkirk. It's all part of the same area. What sort of information existed about Jimmy Finlayson? There's very little. He occasionally gets referred to by modern people writing about him as Finn, and I don't think he was ever called that. I don't think he even liked being called that. He was a very peculiar man. He liked to drink. He ended up marrying a woman who was much younger than him, which was always going to kind of end badly. But I think he took the view that, well, you know, 5 years of near unhappiness with a good-looking young woman in your bed is a small price to pay for whatever regrets you might have afterwards. And I think he was quite close. He got on well with Stan Laurel in particular, because Stan Laurel can be quite clubbable and can be quite sociable. But actually, there's very little. You know, he is one of these characters who, if you're not a Laurel Hardy fan, he doesn't really mean much in the great context of the thing. He is this guy in the background. He's a very good supporting player who has found his way from the stage to Hollywood. But I think there's probably a very good book to be written about him as an individual. The problem is, though, as with Oliver Hardy, when we were just talking a little bit earlier, I remember saying to you that actually, I don't think you could write a book like he about Oliver Hardy, because the biographical information that you need is simply not there to the same degree that it is with Stan Laurel. Oliver Hardy is a much more nebulous figure in that, unlike Stan Laurel, he doesn't write letters.
He's actually ashamed of his education. His writing isn't very good. When you do see some of the letters he's written to wives, for example, or bits of correspondence, you can see it's quite halting. He doesn't have that fluidity, that comfort with grammar that Stan Laurel does. And also, because he dies in 1957, he dies before people like John McKay begin that process of interviewing Stan Laurel and the people involved in the films to get their perspective on what happened and to find out a little bit about the circumstances that brought them together. Oliver Hardy's gone by that stage. So we know we don't have a great deal about Oliver Hardy. And even when I was trying to piece together the book, often what we have comes from bits of information in other people's books, people who crossed paths with him at some point and had some small perspective on him. And I think you might run into the same problem with Jimmy Finlayson, because there isn't quite enough biographical material on him. It would be quite a job, I think, to track down. Even what you were talking about earlier, where was he born exactly? Even those things, even his age is not entirely clear, because guys like him go to Hollywood and shave a couple of years off their age to start with, you know? So they become quite difficult figures to write about, I think, these players who hover in the background.
It's interesting you mentioned you thought that A Chump at Oxford was probably the last great
very unconditionally good film, I think.
I remember the thing I always remember about Chump at Oxford was when Stan had been hit in the head and he kept referring to Oliver as fatty, and he'd say, over here, fatty, and every time he did it, Hardy would look at it, because he didn't like being the big guy, you know, like he didn't like, and it was the look. So it's like, you know, it wasn't being hurtful, but it must have really, you know, it was a wee joke sort of thing, you know.
Sure. It is interesting when you see in his correspondence, Stan Laurel tends to refer to Oliver Hardy as Hardy throughout. He doesn't use it, and I think most people called him Babe. People who knew him well were quite happy to call him Babe. And it's almost like in his letters and in his discussions with critics, Stan Laurel creates a kind of separation between their professional existences and their personal existences to some degree, in that, you know, I don't think if they went out for drinks together, he would have referred to him as Hardy. That would be a very strange thing for somebody to do. And yet he does clearly make this distinction in his prose between us. And I think it was, and it's a reflection of a kind of truth in their lives as well, in that they were very professionally. But often after working maybe on 2 films together, they wouldn't see each other for a month or 2. You know, they would take time out. And Oliver Hardy would very much close the door of his house. And by the time when he was with Lucille, who I think is the wife that was with him until his death, he was very happy to be with her. He was very happy simply to close the door on that. And so they give each other space. I think that's a really interesting thing about them. They're very fond of each other, yet they're very conscious about boundaries, I think. And that again makes it difficult when you begin writing about them, because I don't think at any point one of them turned to the other and said how much they cared about each other. You kind of have to see how they behave towards each other to grasp just how much affection and respect they had.
Definitely. The questions are starting to come in now, John. So one from Gavin Mitchell, good pal of mine, Gavi, and I think he touched on this. Gavin was asking, is it true that Stan still continued to write sketches for them both after Ollie had passed away? Is that?
Yes, he did. He kept yellow legal pads. That was what he wrote on, and he would try and write something. He would try to write something almost every day. We know from when people like Dick Van Dyke would go to visit him, or Jerry Lewis, that he would often have a piece of paper beside him that he was working on, and he would occasionally read some little bit of business that he'd written down that would have worked for Laurel and Hardy. And those actors were because they were not very good at generating their own material often, they were always asking him if he would write something, or if they could even play, you know, a version of Oliver Hardy with him, so that at least people would be able to see him again and have some of this material replicated. And he refused. He point blank refused to do it. It was not for public consumption. And I think it was very much a way, not only for him to keep a creative muscle working, But I think deep down, it was a way of having Oliver Hardy's presence back in his life again. Because if he could write these sketches, they'd been together so long, he could imagine that voice, I think, and he could imagine that presence. So they weren't there for somebody like Dick Van Dyke to put on a fat suit and a mustache. I know Dick Van Dyke, lovely, Doug, and was hugely, very solicitous towards Stan Laurel all his life. But that was not the purpose of the sketches. And I think there was at one point a talk of them being published, or I know his daughter, before she died, was being asked whether they might be published. And I think she was quite, as I remember, was quite resistant to it, because he would not have wanted them to be published. And yet, like, they presume they form part of his archive now, I would imagine. But there is something very touching and moving about that, I think.
I agree. I think it is. It is quite. There's a poignancy about that, and a sign of respect. I think that he was still in his mind, sort of thing, in his thoughts. Got another question here from our dear friend Jerry Andrews, who's asking, given that I am in the Panopticon, and given that Stan Laurel made his debut many years ago up there, what was it like for you being on the Panopticon stage when you launched?
Well, actually, at the moment, can I just say how much I'm missing it? It would have been so lovely to be replicating, to be doing this on that stage, because I don't know how many. This is a lovely event, the idea of these open doors events, and it's just unfortunate that it's virtual at the moment. But the Panopticon is just this hidden gem. Because before I went to it, I had no conception of what it might be. But you kind of go up this kind of little back stairs, and suddenly you're in this gorgeous old theatre. And there is a real sense of almost passing through time, which I very rarely felt before. Because I suppose if I go to a Victorian theatre like the Olympia in Dublin, there are certain concessions to modernity in it. And I've been there and I've watched bands. Whereas the Panopticon seems like something very different. It feels like a little piece of time that's been preserved. So for me, it was a huge honor to stand on that stage. And I think, it's the best event I've ever done. I think it was the best speech I've ever made. And I think in part because I was so conscious that I was in this place that had given birth to him, and I felt a kind of duty to do it as well as possible. But inevitably, in somewhere like the Panopticon, you raise your game. The place brings you up a little bit. Yeah. And it's only, I remember those when it was one of the details I left out of the book, but I think it's quite lovely. I remember when he arrived in Glasgow with Oliver Hardy, they were mobbed. I mean, they were literally mobbed. And police horses had to try and break up the crowds. It's almost inconceivable to imagine just how much people wanted to be near them. And I remember when he got into his hotel and he was brushing himself, he realized someone had nicked his watch. For God's sake, this is the guy has just come home, and so he arrived in and his watch was gone. Not casting any aspersions at all on the people of Glasgow, because it could have been someone from Falkirk. We just
We
don't know.
A friend of mine, his father, before he saw them, and in Glasgow, I think it was the second tour, the 50s, he says, and they were old men by that stage, he says, but they were absolutely wonderful. Right from the minute when they play the theme tune, which must be one of the greatest theme tunes ever, because as soon as you hear that, you know what's coming, sort of thing. And that was what they. And he said what happened was the orchestra played it, and then they stopped and nothing happened, and the audience then played it. The orchestra then played it again, and nothing happened. And of course, by this time, everybody's starting to think there's something wrong. He says, and then the baton tapped and they played it on the walk. He says, and it was unbelievable. And it was one of those things that, he was my friend's father. And you think, what do they know? What have they seen? What have they done? And he had seen Laurel and Hardy live, basically.
There's a lovely story about them when they're coming into Southampton for the first time. And I think what's really interesting is for much of certainly at the start of their careers, because the media doesn't exist in quite the way that it does now, they're not aware of how much affection they're held in. They're not aware of even how successful they are. And it's really only when they leave Los Angeles, they're trying to get on a train in Chicago. And again, the train is mobbed by people who just want to touch them and see them. And it's the first inkling they have that actually they are successful outside this little Hollywood bubble. But there's the moment where they're arriving into Southampton and it's misty and foggy and they can hear something in the distance. And it's this crowd of thousands of people whistling their theme tune. And it's the most extraordinary moment. And I think when they went back, when they went to for their final tour, they arrived in Ireland first and they went into Cove. And the cathedral bells, because you could kind of program the bells in that kind of primitive way, had been programmed again to play their theme tune as the ship came in. And I think Stan Laurel burst into tears. You know, even then, I think that they had this extraordinary gratitude, I think. And I think they had an awful fear that a lot of artists do. I know I have it as a writer, that tastes will change, that you will be forgotten, that people will lose interest in you. And to have those moments, that tour wasn't maybe the most successful thing they ever did. And yet there were extraordinary moments in it. They had not been forgotten, that there were people who held them in such deep affection.
There was actually there was a question came up there from somebody called Debbie, but it's disappeared.
I think it was asking whether I would write another piece. There we go. Would you write another piece?
Well done. Yeah, you can obviously read and talk at the same time. I missed that. Debbie, I didn't realize you were seeing these questions. So Debbie was asking, would you write any other biography-style novels?
You know, I wrote about Stan Laurel because I can see, there's another genius here in the penultimate. Yeah. I don't know. You know, I had such an affection for them, and there was something that hadn't quite been done before. I think they hadn't been written about, I felt, in quite that way before. There had been certainly there had been stage plays imagining their lives together, but not so much in novel form. It's really difficult. It's a very hard thing to do, in part because I think you have an obligation towards. Now, there are friends of mine who will differ on this and will say that actually fiction has no obligation to reality at all. There's a certain truth there, but I think it has an obligation to truth. And when you're dealing with real people, you have to step quite carefully. You don't have complete artistic freedom to reimagine their lives and reconstruct them. And it was really, I mean, I probably spent a decade assembling the material for it. And then a lot of years not writing it because I didn't feel I was a good enough writer to do justice to these two men and to Stan Laurel in particular. I mean, I do want to return to writing fiction that is historical. I'm curious about that, and I enjoy the process of research. But I don't think there's anybody particularly in that creative area for whom I have the same degree of affection and respect. Maybe the writer Ross MacDonald would be the only one who would come even close to it. And a friend of mine has Declan Hughes, who's a playwright, has been dramatizing the correspondence between the writer Ross MacDonald and Eudora Welty, the Southern novels. And so he may have got there before me anyway. So I like this question. It's very good.
I didn't pay him to ask this question, but I will. Is there a modern day equivalent of Stan Laurel apart from film?
Well, yes, present company notwithstanding. I don't think so, because I don't think the circumstances that gave rise to these men, as much in the same way the circumstances gave rise to Chaplin or even to Abbott and Costello, they simply don't exist anymore. Where, you know, these guys came up the hard way through places like the Panopticon, and, you know, again, for people who are not aware of the history of the Panopticon, you know, there were animals kept there. There was a brothel upstairs. This was not an easy place to play the crowd, you know. It was a bear pit in quite literal terms. And then, you know, so you spend a lot of time on the stage learning your craft. And then Stan Laurel, he went to America. He worked in vaudeville, learning his craft again. He then spends years in Hollywood as essentially not really succeeding. He's forever being molded to be a solo star. And it never quite catches, because in part, I think, because he didn't have a character in the way that Harold Lloyd has a character. Buster Keaton has a character. Chaplin has a character. Stan Laurel never has that. He's shoehorned into roles I think that other actors could have played with a degree of skill. And it's only when he's put with Oliver Hardy that something meshes, that a piece of magic comes together. And it takes Stan Laurel a long time even to accept the fact that he's not going to be a solo star. Oliver Hardy always knew he would be a character actor, and I think was happy being that. But for a long time, Stan Laurel had been told that he was going to be a star, and it didn't happen until he had to become one of twin stars, I suppose. So I don't think it's very hard to see that happening again, because you almost have less time and space to fail now. You have less time and space to experiment. You have less time and space to learn your craft in that way, because those theaters are largely gone. We don't have that variety circuit anymore. The closest is maybe places like the Comedy Store, and that's not quite the same thing. So, I mean, we will have great comedians. The world will keep producing great comic talents, but we will never have comic talents that matured and that came into being in quite the way that people like Chaplin or Stan Laurel or Buster Keaton came into being, I think.
One of the things that I admire about Stan Laurel is, I mean, he came through the silent era, when he was doing all the silent, and then when the talkies came in, his use of words, the beautiful use of words that he used, and I think most people know that he was the writer, he was the guy that wrote the gags and what have you. But that he made that transition, because an awful lot of them didn't. A lot of the guys, you remember when Bob Monkhouse used to show mad movies, and he would show all these clips. And Stan Laurel, I've seen, Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride, which gets mentioned in the book. I remember seeing that, and he's brilliant in it. A very manic, quite scary, silent. Mm-hmm. But he made that thing where he adapted to the written word, and some of the great phrases, as it, like whenever he would come up with a stupid idea, and Oliver Hardy would say, "Tell me that again," and he would tell him it, and everybody knew it was a terrible idea, but the fact that he thought it was a good idea, or he could make it work, that's a wonderful thing, that you were dragged in. I must keep watching this just to see what an arse that they're going to make of this idea.
It's very interesting what you say. The other transition, as you're right, they were, one of the things that helped them, I think, was that to some degree their voices matched their characters to some degree. They that worked. But another thing was that they were comfortable with that transition from, although it was difficult, from silent to sound. And one of the things that struck me, that had never struck me before until I did this research, although it's blindingly obvious, is that you can obviously record a silent film on a noisy soundstage. Okay, so you can have people walking around and moving stuff and dogs barking or whatever, and it doesn't matter because there's no microphone to pick up sound. But a sound film has to be recorded on an entirely silent stage. You can't have any background noise from anybody. And so this is the first generation of comedians that has to learn how to act without being able to hear laughter. Nobody before that has ever had to deal with that problem, with the issue of acting without an audience response. And it's the beginning of an internalization of the acting process, I think. And it's felt most profoundly by comedians who thrive on laughter. You see, that's what gels you. And suddenly you're in a situation where not even the camera guys are allowed to laugh because the microphones are so sensitive that everybody has to be quiet. And yet they managed that transition too. That transition into a different style of performance, I think.
Yeah, I still think, see, if you watch an awful lot of the later stuff, or the talkies, and you turn the sound down, there is so much great physical comedy there. You can get a laugh at it without hearing the words. Yeah. And then when you hear them talking, it's working on two different levels. Like the music box, for example, the number of sight gags and slapstick, to call it a bit, well, it could almost work as a silent, but the conversation just adds to it. There was another question come up there from Peter Crilly. Can somebody fire that up again? Here it is. During your research, did you find out anything about Stan that really surprised you, apart from all his women?
Yeah. Well, the women.
That was quite well known, though, wasn't it? I mean, I'm no expert.
I hadn't realised how the attachment he had to Alice Ardell, this actress whose presence in his life moves through at least 3 marriages, that she is somebody whom he keeps coming back and yet never commits in that way. And again, she's quite a nebulous figure. That I still, even after all the research, I'm still not quite sure why he didn't in the end turn to her. That there was clearly a deep attachment there between them, and maybe she had he felt she had a reputation. Maybe he was still quite aware of his public persona. I don't know, but I think I find the relationship with Alice Ardell really interesting, and there's almost like a little subsection that one could write about. The one thing I hadn't spotted, and I went to an awful lot of, one of the reasons why the book took so long to write was because anytime a character, even a peripheral character, entered his life, I tried to find out everything I possibly could about that character. Because, quite often these people did fascinating stories themselves. And I thought it was really interesting that he stayed in touch with Lou Costello. And, superficially there's a similarity between Abbott and Costello and Laurel and Hardy, but Abbott and Costello's comedy is much cruder. And I think Lou Costello was quite an odd man. He was known as a kleptomaniac. I mean, he would steal, in between setups, he would steal stuff from the sets of the films he was working on. They come back and a lamp would be gone, and they go and search his car. And I think it was a kind of game to him, but he wasn't naturally somebody I think that Stan Laurel would have gravitated towards. And yet they spent a lot of time. They would have dinner together and commiserate with each other. And when Chaplin was being hounded by the FBI, Lou Costello was one of the few people who stood up publicly for him, who took a chance and did it. And I could never quite figure out why that was. And it was only when I went and I was reading a book about Lou Costello. And as we know, Stan Laurel's only son, died just a few days after childbirth. He didn't live very, very long. Lou Costello's child had drowned in the swimming pool of their garden while his wife's back was turned. His son had died. And Charlie Chaplin also lost a child. His son was born malformed and I don't think lived a day. And so they are three men united by the fact that they have all at one point lost infant sons. And I think at one point perhaps there was that connection between Stan Laurel and Lou Costello on that part. And perhaps it was also one of the things that inclined Lou Costello to stand up for Chaplin. That if you've suffered in that way, you'll take a stand for somebody who suffered in a similar way. Even if you're not necessarily entirely on side with their politics or their behavior, you may stand up for them because you have that connection. There is a connection formed from not necessarily just grief, but an understanding of grief. And I suppose to go back to one of the questions you asked me earlier, that's the potency of a piece of fiction. You can trace those interconnections and you can suggest to the reader that, yes, perhaps there is something here. You can accept it or not accept it, but here's a little interesting piece of information to go with this little scene. And you take that away and you decide.
Unbelievably, we've been talking for about 45 minutes. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. And I just wanted to ask a
question, Phil. Sorry. To what extent, because you're a writer as well, to what extent were you influenced by them, do you think? What extent does your comic work take on their influence?
Well, as a writer, I write gags. I don't write novels yet. We're always working on sitcoms. It's comedy is what I write, basically. And I was always intrigued by the fact that I used to think that the actors made it up as they went along. They just happened to be really, really funny. And they went and see what happens. And there was no such thing as editing or retakes or anything like that. And Stan Laurel was one of the first guys I realised, he actually writes. Somebody said, he writes the stuff. And I would say, well, what do you mean he writes the stuff? And he said, well, he writes it. He writes the gag and he writes what Oliver's reaction is going to be, sort of thing. And so much of what I wrote in the early days, it was, sketches and things like that. It's two guys, and they were like the perfect idiot and the informed idiot. The guy comes up with a stupid idea and the guy goes, that's a great idea. And between them, they mess it all up. I think what I learned was the importance of the relationship in comedy, between the antagonist, the protagonist, whatever you want to call them, in a sketch. And I learned so much from watching them. But the main thing was the timing. how the absolute perfection in time, and there's a right time for the brick to hit him on the head. And if you do it earlier, it's not as funny. If you do it later, can't even remember the name of the film. It's the one where Oliver falls down the chimney, and I think there's like 3 bricks hitting in quick succession, bang, 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 and he stops and he looks at the camera, and then he just goes to look, and just as he goes to look up, another brick hits him, and it is wonderful. It's absolutely, it's joyous. And when I would see that, I would say, how could I write something where the joke, the punchline comes in at the point where, you know, it's that right moment where you know, it has maximum effect, sort of thing. So I watch them. It's an interesting thing amongst other writers. Not everybody likes Laurel and Hardy. Some people, friends of mine, colleagues. Oh, John Sessions, brilliant. I remember John and I having a conversation, and John said that, oh, Laurel and Hardy is two people doing things slowly, was how he described it. You know, it was the pace that he couldn't go in. Yeah. And, you know, we agreed on so many other things, but that he definitely didn't like them. But I loved them, and I didn't like them. The last question I was going to ask you, actually, which I can answer for me, was at first they did annoy me. I didn't like them at first, and as I grew older, I found I just sort of funnier. And you know, like, it's hard to tell sometimes. You know, like Laurel's feeding Hardy all these wonderful lines for him to react to, and his reaction thing you said, Hardy was probably the better actor, the character actor, and he could play that the southern, you know, that fidgeting with a tie, and you know, being a gentleman, being a southerner, chivalry is my middle name, and all that. So then he makes a complete arse or something. And I think, you know, from that point of view, I just loved the idea. The pomposity was always coming, you know, he was always sort of like undermining himself, sort of thing.
Yeah, what you say, sorry, what you say, Ray,
really, sorry, John, carry on. Sorry.
So the little clip we showed at the beginning from their first mistake, we sometimes think of them almost as purely physical comedians. A lot of us think of as routines. But I picked that little section because I think that's a perfectly written exchange and perfectly paced exchange, and at the same time says something profound about their relationship. I think it's a lovely piece of writing, and that film is a very wordy film for them. There's an awful lot of dialogue going on that's been very carefully put together. And I think sometimes he didn't get the credit he deserves as somebody who's actually able to, I should say, he was very good with words, playing with words and seeing how they fit it, and playing with timing of words.
Yeah. Also in that scene, they're behaving like kids. You know, they're rolling.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful innocence of a couple of kids discussing an adult theme. She says you like him. You know, it's just so wonderful. You know, and that I mean, there's so many. I mean, like I didn't pick any clips because I couldn't. Basically, I was going through this one, that one, and I couldn't find them because I'm not very good on the computers anyway. But the one with the bricks, that one, you know, for the physicality of that, and then when you watch the one, The Way Out West, when everybody always goes to the Trail of the Lonesome Pine. If you remember, they do a dance routine before that. Yeah. You know, it commences dancing or whatever it is. I'm probably that's not the words. And it's the big, you know, Laurel and Hardy. It's the gentleness of Oliver Hardy's movements, which is wonderful as well. And they're not trying to upstage each other or anything. They both know what they're good at, and they let each other get on with it. And the last thing I'll say, I always found this incredibly moving when they were old men and they were on the television, seeing themselves on television. Stan Laurel looking at them and saying, what a funny guy Oliver Hardy was. And Oliver Hardy looking at it and saying, what a funny guy Stan Laurel was. I mean, that's beautiful. That's absolutely wonderful. John, we've reached the end, or the people, we've reached the end. That's us running out of time now. So for everybody who's tuned in or sent questions and ever, thanks for joining us as part of the...
An absolute gent. It's been a pleasure dealing with you and talking with you. I wish you continued success.
Thank you very much, and to you and anybody. Get He by John Connell. It's a fabulous, absolutely fabulous read. There you go. I'm managing to get that. And listen.